In everyone's life, there come moments when it's necessary to pause, reevaluate the journey so far, and heal emotional wounds. That's precisely what the author intends to do in order to build relationships in the future that are based on unwavering faith in each other and deep mutual understanding. Addressing everyone who offered support during a difficult period, the author urges caution in assessing the degree of understanding between partners. Even the slightest action that could hurt another person's feelings can cause a breakup. This lesson was learned through bitter experience, and now the author hopes that others can avoid similar mistakes. The key element of any relationship is open and sincere communication. It's important not to be afraid to express your thoughts and feelings, share your experiences and doubts. Close attention must be paid to resolving emerging problems, preventing them from escalating into large-scale conflicts that can irreparably damage the bond between two loving hearts. The author expresses deep gratitude to everyone who took the time to listen to her story and offers support in a difficult moment, easing the emotional pain. I made fun of his insecurities, thinking it was funny. He felt humiliated and left, the author shares. What follows is a long story, full of revelations and reflections on how seemingly insignificant actions can lead to unpredictable consequences. To understand how the protagonist's views on marriage were formed, it's worth looking at her past. She spent about 5 years in a relationship with a man named Jake, and a little over a year ago, they legalized their union. It's noteworthy that initially, neither she nor her chosen one considered marriage to be a given. The young people were passionate about their careers and quite satisfied with their stable relationship, without striving for formalities. Neither of them considered a stamp in their passport to be a prerequisite for happiness or a factor that could radically change their lives. However, over time, the girl's worldview underwent a transformation. The turning point was her sister's wedding, which took place several years ago. The celebration made an indelible impression on her. From the touching ceremony to the delightful reception, everything was thought out to the smallest detail. This event made the protagonist reconsider her own beliefs about marriage. She began to see it as more than just a formality, but as a symbol of deep connection and a special union that she wanted to experience for herself. The girl shared her new thoughts with Jake, telling him about her desire to one day organize her own wedding and formalize their relationship. To her joy, her beloved showed understanding and support. He was sincerely happy about her aspiration and expressed his readiness to build a future together. It became obvious that he wanted to see her happy and was willing to meet her dreams. As a result, Jake proposed to her a year ago, and their wedding became the embodiment of all her dreams. The first day of their life together was marked by an idyll, as if it had come from the pages of a romantic story, and the honeymoon was an unforgettable period. It seemed that the beginning of their married life foreshadowed a cloudless future, and the first year of marriage was filled with harmony. Jake, the 27-year-old husband, proved himself to be an attentive and caring partner, striving to do everything possible for his 26-year-old chosen one. They both believed in the strength of their union and the joint construction of something meaningful. Their marriage was based on a traditional structure. Jake took on the role of breadwinner, providing for the family and paying the bills, while his wife devoted herself to housekeeping. At first glance, their life seemed perfect. The relationship was filled with love and understanding, and the chosen model of interaction suited both of them. Jake constantly showed sensitivity and care, making his wife feel happy with him. However, there was an aspect in their relationship that overshadowed the overall picture: the wife's tendency to joke and make ironic remarks. She always had a knack for finding the comical in almost everything, making witty comments and jokes, even if it touched on topics that others might consider delicate. For her, it was a way to cope with life's difficulties and maintain a positive attitude. But Jake didn't share her love of humor. As it turned out later, he suffered from hidden insecurities that his wife didn't fully realize. Despite his attractive appearance and athletic build, Jake carried a heavy burden of emotional experiences from the past. The past years, overshadowed by bullying and the bitterness of what he had experienced, left an indelible mark on his soul. Self-esteem, like a fragile flower, drooped under the hail of ridicule and abuse that haunted him during his formative years. This burden of the past created in Jake a whole series of complexities that he never managed to cope with, like wounds that would not heal. Outwardly, he may have seemed like the embodiment of confidence, but deep down, he struggled with insecurity and feelings of inadequacy, like a shadow that relentlessly followed him. The author wasn't always aware of the depth of these emotional wounds, especially since Jake appeared outwardly strong and driven. Her jokes and teasing, which she considered harmless displays of friendliness, actually struck the most painful chords in his soul. She never intended to hurt him. Her words were meant to be light and funny, but she didn't realize how deeply they wounded his heart. Her attempts to joke sometimes hit his most vulnerable spot. Moreover, Jake didn't often share his feelings, so the author didn't immediately realize the impact of her behavior until it was too late. He preferred to keep his feelings to himself, and when he did express discomfort or pain, it manifested in subtle signs that weren't always noticeable. Like thin ice hiding a raging storm beneath, his silence concealed a tempest of emotions that, unnoticed, ultimately led to tragic consequences. She believed that teasing Jake about his vulnerabilities was perfectly acceptable behavior, sincerely believing that it would make him laugh and, paradoxically, strengthen his self-confidence. In her understanding, ironic remarks on sensitive topics served as a way to establish a closer connection, demonstrating that these shortcomings didn't matter much and confirming that they were close enough to tease each other carelessly. She didn't intend to cause pain, however. Analyzing the past, she realizes the error of her ways. At first, Jake responded with laughter to her barbs, even if they stung him. He tried to force a smile or chuckle, and she took this as confirmation that everything was fine. She naively believed that if he was laughing, he wasn't hurting. But over time, she began to notice changes in his behavior. Jake was no longer as willing to laugh in response to her jokes. Instead, he would fall silent. His smile would disappear, and at times he looked extremely depressed. She disregarded these signs, attributing everything to his excessive sensitivity or need to become more resilient. She convinced herself that it was just a harmless joke, and he should understand that she wasn't serious. But the truth is that she now realizes that her behavior wasn't limited to just jokes. She systematically exploited his insecurities for her own amusement, turning it into a habit. This behavior wasn't a one-time offense, but a consistent trend, a kind of cruel habit that unfortunately wasn't perceived as reprehensible for a long time. The protagonist regularly made cutting remarks to Jake in public places, where the feeling of awkwardness was especially acute. At family celebrations, friendly parties, wedding ceremonies, or game nights, she constantly found opportunities for sarcastic remarks regarding Jake's insecurities. It seemed that she couldn't restrain herself, although deep down, she certainly understood that she was doing wrong. Once, during a dinner party with friends, the conversation turned to memories of childhood. Jake, with some hesitation, shared a story about how he was teased in school for being overweight. It was a moment when he showed his vulnerability, but instead of supporting him or expressing sympathy, the protagonist added a joke that Jake was lucky that she met him after he started going to the gym. The attendees reacted with laughter, but Jake didn't share their amusement. He remained silent, as if shrinking into himself. In another instance, at a family barbecue, Jake's father mentioned his difficulties with sports as a child. Instead of supporting Jake or tactfully changing the subject, the protagonist inserted a barb that his lack of coordination was probably the reason for his current avoidance of physical exercise. The guest chuckled, but Jake's smile wasn't reflected in his eyes. It's worth noting that this behavior wasn't only manifested in the presence of outsiders. Alone, the protagonist continued to behave similarly. Once, Jake organized a dinner for two, which was a significant event for him, as he wasn't known for his culinary talents. Usually, for special evenings, he ordered food for delivery, knowing his limited cooking skills. However, instead of appreciating his efforts, the protagonist made a joke about his culinary ineptitude. She expressed dissatisfaction that they would have to settle for food from a restaurant again, despite knowing how hard Jake had tried. At that moment, she didn't realize how much her words could hurt him. Looking back, the author recounts instances where her humor, directed at her loved one, Jake, caused him pain and discomfort. In one such case, an old scar on Jake's face, a remnant of a past injury, became a recurring target of her teasing. Despite his displeasure, she brushed it off, claiming he was being overly sensitive. Now she realizes that her words made him self-conscious about something that was already a sensitive subject for him. Even Jake's personality traits, such as his shyness and reserved nature in public displays of affection, became fodder for jokes. The author would tease him for not holding her hand or acting stiff in social settings, failing to recognize that her behavior only amplified his embarrassment and discomfort. However, the author's humor wasn't limited to minor moments. Even more personal and delicate topics, such as Jake's financial insecurities, became the subject of her jokes. Once, Jake confessed that he felt insecure about his career and worried about not providing enough for them. Instead of offering support, she tried to lighten the mood with a joke about how she was the main breadwinner in the family, even though he was the one working. This seemingly harmless joke likely made him feel inadequate and undervalued. It wasn't just career-related issues that became the target of her teasing. The author also made jokes about his physical abilities. During joint workouts, when Jake struggled with an exercise, she would laugh at him, believing it would motivate him. Now she understands that it most likely exacerbated his feelings of inadequacy. Over time, all these seemingly insignificant episodes formed a sad pattern that the narrator, unfortunately, failed to notice. Every barb, every taunt, gradually chipped away at Jake's self-confidence, making him feel insignificant and humiliated. She naively believed she was just joking, but in reality, she was inflicting deep wounds on the person dearest to her. Looking back, she regrets not having the wisdom to realize how deeply her words affected Jake. She regrets not seeing the destructive impact of her jokes sooner, continuing down this harmful path, convinced of their harmlessness. The narrator ignored warning signs, the quiet pauses that followed her cutting remarks, the moments when Jake seemed to withdraw into himself. Instead of showing sensitivity and understanding, she continued to make the situation worse with each thoughtless word. She made fun of literally everything, setting no boundaries in her quest to appear witty. Now she realizes that her jokes were far from harmless. At the time, she didn't understand that she was destroying the very person she claimed to love. For example, during one of their traditional game nights with friends, the conversation turned to their school years. Recalling their first dates, the narrator thought it was funny to mention that it took Jake a long time to ask her out in high school. She laughed at his shyness and awkwardness back then, believing it was just a harmless joke. However, she didn't consider how it might make Jake feel. She even shamelessly mocked his teenage insecurities, knowing full well that the topic still embarrassed him. During a joint vacation with friends, a situation arose on the beach that exposed a sensitive issue. Jake, feeling self-conscious about his physique, hesitated to take off his shirt. Instead of showing sensitivity and understanding, the narrator, seeking to lighten the mood, flippantly declared that he had nothing to be ashamed of and urged him to leave his youthful complexes in the past. However, as she now realizes, such support only exacerbated his discomfort and embarrassment. Instead of providing the necessary support and tact, she inadvertently exposed him, making him vulnerable in the eyes of their friends. Even at the family table, the narrator didn't miss an opportunity to tease Jake. She shared stories about the beginning of their relationship, portraying Jake as timid and indecisive, emphasizing that she had to take the initiative. These stories, presented in a joking manner, created the impression of Jake as someone incapable of decisive action, lacking confidence in courtship. Now the narrator understands that her seemingly harmless jokes probably deeply wounded Jake, making him ashamed of his natural shyness instead of accepting it as an integral part of his personality. She believed that her jokes and teasing towards Jake were just a way to help him laugh at his insecurities and complexes. However, as it turned out, she was achieving the exact opposite effect. Instead of nurturing and strengthening his spirit, she was essentially dismantling it, making him feel insignificant and inadequate. Each barb, each snide remark, chipped away at his self-esteem, little by little, until almost nothing was left. Now, she regretfully realizes that she didn't understand the pain her thoughtless words were causing Jake. She bitterly regrets not being more sensitive, more loving, and more attentive to how deeply her so-called humor wounded him. All that remains for her is to look back and wish she had acted differently, that she had chosen kindness over cruelty, support over sarcasm. But alas, the time is lost. The culmination of everything was a group dinner with friends. In the midst of a casual conversation at the table, when the topic turned to their school years, she, wanting to add some levity, joked about Jake's height in high school. She mentioned that he was shorter back then and even jokingly stated that she didn't blame the bullies for teasing him, adding that she might have done the same. In conclusion, she noted that he was lucky he grew up and was tall now. She expected it to be taken as innocent teasing, but when she looked at Jake, she saw something completely different in his eyes, something she hadn't noticed before. He was humiliated. He tried to laugh it off, even forced a smile, but it was obvious to everyone present that he was deeply hurt. An awkward pause interrupted the conversation, and she realized that she had crossed a line. However, she didn't yet realize how deeply. That realization came later that night when they returned home. Jake, taking her aside, spoke in a restrained but tension-filled voice. He confessed that her jokes made him feel belittled and vulnerable. Over the years, he had worked hard to build his self-esteem, and according to him, her constant jabs felt like painful blows. He expressed feeling unappreciated, and each of her jokes seemed to diminish his self-confidence. Such a confession caught her off guard. She didn't know how to react. In her understanding, she was just trying to lighten the mood and add some fun. In response, she stated that he was overreacting, that they were just jokes, and he shouldn't take them so personally. However, Jake wasn't going to tolerate it. He looked at her with an intensity she hadn't noticed before and asked a question that sounded like a bolt from the blue. How would she feel if he constantly made jokes about her weight? This question hit her with its full weight. She felt overwhelmed and defeated. The desire to apologize arose instantly, but before she could find the words, Jake simply turned and left. The following days marked a radical change in the established order of life. Jake, who previously, despite being tired after work, always found time to help around the house, suddenly stopped doing so. He seemed to isolate himself from the world with a wall of silence, ignoring any attempts to talk to him and avoiding even chance encounters in the house. He completely withdrew into himself, as if his wife had ceased to exist for him. The usual help with household chores and cooking, though not always successful, ceased. In every moment of chance encounters in the house, she noticed a deep sadness in his eyes that echoed painfully in her heart. After 4 days of agonizing silence, Jake packed his things and left the house without saying a word about the purpose of his departure and without answering any of her numerous questions. He simply left, throwing her into a state of panic. Such behavior was completely uncharacteristic of Jake, and she was terrified, trying to make sense of what had happened. Desperately trying to contact him, she called and sent messages, begging for forgiveness and assuring him of her sincere desire to change and become more sensitive to his feelings. However, in response, she received only a short message stating that he needed personal space. This news tormented her soul, but she understood that she had to respect his need for privacy. At that moment, she realized the depth of the offense she had caused him and how far she had gone in their relationship. A wave of regret washed over her, and all the cutting jokes and careless remarks she had ever made came to mind. It became obvious that she had neglected his feelings, and this realization was devastating. She deeply regrets the suffering she caused Jake. Now she realizes that her actions inflicted painful wounds on him, and her jokes, which seemed harmless, were actually sharp barbs that undermined his self-confidence. The prospect of losing Jake is unbearable for her, and she strives to make amends and restore the lost harmony in their relationship. However, she feels lost, not knowing where to start this process of redemption. Fear grips her, the fear that she's gone too far. That's why she's reaching out for help, honestly laying out her situation in the hope of getting valuable advice. She's determined to be better for Jake, to prove to him that she can change and that his feelings are paramount to her. She's willing to go to any lengths to make amends, but she needs guidance to understand how to do it. If anyone has faced a similar situation or has knowledge of how to regain trust and rebuild a relationship after hurting a loved one, she would be immensely grateful for guidance. Her love for Jake and her unwillingness to lose him because of her own short-sightedness are driving her to seek reconciliation. In an update to her post, she reports that she has been subjected to harsh but fair criticism from Reddit users. Many have called her an abuser, and she admits that she deserves that label. She recognizes her guilt and has no intention of justifying herself or complaining about the community's reaction. Acknowledging her mistake is not easy for her, but she accepts responsibility for her actions. She admits that she made a serious mistake, and she alone is to blame for it. Waiting for any news, she couldn't stand the oppressive silence and decided to contact Jake. She stated that they needed to discuss the situation, emphasizing that open communication is the cornerstone of a strong marriage. She naively believed that their union was strong enough to, like other couples, overcome temporary difficulties and emerge from them even more united. However, when the long-awaited response from Jake finally came, the ground seemed to fall out from under her. After a brief exchange of messages, Jake agreed to a video call, during which she barely contained her emotions. Through tears, she expressed deep regret for what she had done and made sincere promises to change. She poured out her soul, demonstrating the full range of emotions: remorse, guilt, and despair. But Jake remained indifferent, as if he had already made a final decision. And then, like a bolt from the blue, came the fateful statement, he wants a divorce. She couldn't believe her ears and tried to find out when things had gone so far. In desperation, she begged Jake to reconsider his decision, but his gaze showed a determination she was completely unprepared for. A decisive conversation took place in which Jake expressed his final position. He stated that further discussions were pointless because his feelings had been systematically ignored and belittled. According to Jake, he had long felt a lack of respect, and his patience had run out. He is no longer willing to remain in a relationship where his self-esteem is constantly under pressure. The only reason he responded to the text message was to inform her of his imminent filing for divorce. In confusion, she tried to find words that could change the situation and prevent the impending disaster. However, when she brought up the issue of their jointly owned home, Jake categorically stated that she needed to leave the house, as it belonged to him. He gave her a few weeks to adjust to the new reality, explaining his sudden departure. What was happening plunged her into a state of shock, akin to a nightmarish dream from which she wanted to wake up immediately. Jake's transformation in such a short period of time was so radical that he seemed like a complete stranger. She couldn't understand how their relationship could have deteriorated so rapidly. Perhaps she naively believed that they had time and opportunity to recover. Now, faced with the prospect of divorce, she feels her world crumbling to pieces. The future seems bleak and uncertain. She recognizes her mistakes, but never imagined that they could lead to such tragic consequences. Everything she knew about their relationship has been turned upside down, leaving her in a state of complete disorientation and confusion. Greetings, dear Reddit readers. As it turns out, for many of you, recent events were not a bolt from the blue. Some insightful users even foresaw such an outcome, and admittedly, somewhere deep down, there was a glimmer of a thought about the likelihood of such a development. However, despite this, the realization that many consider what happened to be deserved retribution hurts. Criticism can be harsh, but the author acknowledges that her actions were wrong and expresses sincere regret. At the same time, she suggests that some of the critics may have done worse. As for news, several weeks have passed since the last publication, and after heated discussions, the author had no desire to share information. She was filled with rage. How could Jake treat her so dismissively? How could he ruin their marriage over seemingly harmless jokes? Right now, she realizes she was wrong, but at the time, she was driven by anger, not common sense. She spent the first couple of weeks at her parents' house, suffocating with resentment. She kept wondering, who did Jake think he was? They had been through so much together, and was he really ready to leave because of some ridiculous jokes? Yes, they were hurtful, but was that grounds for divorce? At the time, she couldn't see anything beyond her own disappointment. The realization that change was inevitable became a turning point when she understood that she could no longer remain within the walls of the house that had become a cage for her. Packing her things, she made the decision to return to her parents' home. A plan was brewing in her mind to demonstrate to Jake the seriousness of her intentions regarding the divorce he so desired, and to make him feel the bitterness of loss. She dreamed that he would realize the magnitude of his loss, understand that she was not going to give up without a fight, and allow him to erase her from his life like a read newspaper. Her parents, in turn, were shocked by this news. Not expecting such a turn of events, they immediately tried to intervene. They contacted Jake, hoping to convince him to think again, to remind him of the happy moments they had shared together. However, Jake was adamant. He stated directly that she constantly belittled him and did not show due respect, and that he was no longer willing to tolerate it. He emphasized that their relationship was over, and nothing, not even the intervention of her parents, could change his decision. Moreover, he added that any pressure from them would only increase his dislike for her. These words, conveyed through her closest people, were a crushing blow to her. She was disoriented, not knowing how to react. Inside her, anger and a dawning realization of the pain she had caused Jake were fighting. But at that moment, she was filled with confidence in his wrongdoing. She was convinced that he was making a fatal mistake and would certainly regret the divorce. That's how it should be, shouldn't it? And now she was back at square one, trying to understand exactly where this tragic failure had occurred. She continued to convince herself that Jake would realize his mistake, that one day he would understand what value he had lost. But deep down, doubts crept in. Wouldn't she herself have to bitterly regret her behavior towards him? She acknowledged her mistakes, but she found it difficult to get rid of anger and a sense of injustice. It seemed to her that Jake should have shown understanding, realized that she did not want to hurt him, and given her a chance to correct herself before making such a radical decision about divorce. Perhaps only time will tell and show which of them will have more to regret about what happened. The author once again turns to the Reddit community to share her experiences. This time, she reports on the completion of the divorce proceedings and admits to feeling deeply tired and exhausted. She notes that, while staying at her parents' house, she received all the necessary documents. This event did not evoke any specific emotions in her, except for all-consuming fatigue, both physical and mental. The author realizes that this condition may be caused by accumulated stress, regrets, anger, and loneliness. She admits that her body seems to be giving way under the burden of these experiences. Despite the lack of news, she decided to get in touch to remind herself that she continues to move forward, even if it is not always noticeable. Perhaps this exhaustion goes beyond the physical, and everything she has experienced is catching up with her. In her address to Reddit, the author also touched on the topic of toxicity she encountered on the platform. She admitted that she had seen many comments calling for her to get a job. To clarify the situation, she reported that she is currently living with her parents and is not planning to look for a job yet. The divorce is complete, and the process went surprisingly smoothly, with no disputes over alimony, custody, or property division. The author expressed gratitude for such simplicity, noting that perhaps this made the breakup less painful, but at the same time left a feeling of impersonality and abruptness. She confessed that she misses her husband very much. At the final hearing, she struggled to hold back tears and asked Jake if he was sure of his decision. He replied that he could not stay married to someone who constantly belittled him and made him feel inadequate. It was hard for the author to hear, but she understands that she must accept his choice. In conclusion, she again emphasized her feeling of loss and exhaustion, admitting that she doesn't know what to do next or how to move forward. She is trying to make sense of what happened and hopes that she will be able to find clarity over time.